Get ready to take a flamethrower to the official narrative and learn what the elites don't want you to know. You're listening to The Tom Woods Show.
Hey everybody, Tom Woods here, episode 2512, joined by my old friend Kevin Gutzman, who is a professor of history at Western Connecticut State University. He's the author of numerous books of great importance, no doubt the least of which is his co-authored volume with me, Who Killed the Constitution. But a book of very great value, despite its playful title, is The Politically Incorrect Guide to the Constitution, which I highly recommend. Highly. It's way better than anything else you're going to read, and it's certainly better than anything coming out of right-of-center think tanks, the vast bulk of which just takes for granted a whole lot of assumptions that it should not. So you instead want to read Kevin's book. But he's also the author of James Madison and the Making of America, Thomas Jefferson, Revolutionary, the Jeffersonians. The guy just knows everything there is to know about everything. So with that introduction, Kevin, how you doing?
I'm very well. How are you?
I'm doing okay. In fact, you were just trying to make small talk with me, but I was trying to take care of paying a health thing, and I just couldn't talk to you at the same time. So we'll catch up for a few minutes after we're done. But so let's get into what's in the news. Thing is, these days I can't get the episodes out in time to talk about everything that's going on with the Supreme Court because there's so much going on this time of year. So we had the one involving Jay Bhattacharya and some of those folks who were alleging that the federal government, by means of the social media companies, had violated the First Amendment. So we got all that whole thing that came out. Then we've had a decision involving presidential immunity, and then we've had this decision involving what is somewhat pompously known as the, quote, Chevron deference. And I would like to say something, talk a little bit about that. Can you start off by explaining what this is? There's a guy at Columbia Law School named Philip Hamburger, who I think has devoted much of his career to talking about this and arguing against it. And he probably never expected that anything would ever come of it, that actually there would be a real challenge to it. So what was it all about?
Well, before I get to that, Hamburger is an excellent scholar. He wrote a really wonderful book about free exercise, and I recommend anything he writes. What this Chevron deference is about is the question, how much authority administrative agencies have. So people may be unfamiliar with this, but the federal government isn't just three branches. It's not just a few agencies that we all know of with their heads in the cabinet. Instead, it's hundreds and hundreds of agencies. And in fact, repeatedly, prominent people in Congress have complained that there's not an authoritative list of the agencies. So there are well over 400 now, and even chairmen of Senate committees can't get authoritative lists. And the Administrative Procedures Act is the law passed by Congress many decades ago for internal governance of these administrative agencies. So essentially, while the Constitution lays out the general structure of the overall structure of the federal government with the legislative and executive and judicial branch, there is also within the executive branch a lot of room for these agencies that have their internal, more or less, legislative, executive, and judicial personnel. And so they make new rules, they enforce the rules, they essentially serve as their own governments within governments. And the overall government of these administrative agencies is handled by this Administrative Procedures Act, which says that there will be, for example, determination of disputes by people within the administrative agencies, so-called administrative law judges. And if you're in law school, I encourage you to avoid this topic. It's very dry stuff. But what this latest decision was about was a 1984 case called Chevron, in which Justice Scalia uncharacteristically said, well, in general, if there are questions about the interpretation of the legislation from Congress under which one of these administrative agencies is acting, we, the judicial branch, will defer to the agency as to the interpretation of that legislation. So what it amounted to was essentially the judiciary recognizing that the Congress had created these monsters and saying, okay, we consent to that too. And that meant that, of course, all three branches were in on this this project of creating these agencies. And from time to time, there have been outrages committed by administrative agencies in the news. People will be familiar with them. They're, for example, extending their jurisdiction to remote waterways that aren't connected to the oceans or the major rivers under the legislation about the way that laws against pollution and such are supposed to be enforced when it comes to American ports and the oceans. You might think, well, how does that have anything to do with that? And the answer is, well, on its face, it doesn't, but the administrative agencies that are involved in these kinds of things generally have a tendency, surprise, surprise, to extend their power into new areas of American life and new parts of American geography. And that's what this latest case finally got the Supreme Court involved in. Actually, in 1984, Chief Justice Roberts, there had been a previous case in which Chief Justice Roberts had dissented. And so he finds himself in the majority this time in getting rid of this rule of the judiciary to defer to the administrative law judges when it came to interpreting legislation creating particular administrative agencies. This all sounds very tedious, but what it amounts to is having a lot of the federal government be so remote from congressional or even presidential oversight as to be essentially independent. It's as if they weren't governed by anybody.
And you know what's interesting? So on Twitter, of course, you can imagine the response from people who just hold whatever opinion they're told to hold, but also from, let's say, I don't know, the legal establishment. I mean, would you say that Lawrence Tribe, if there were a legal establishment, he belongs to it? And
well, I remember in the 1980s, Senate Judiciary Committee Chairman Joseph Biden saying that to Tribe in a Judiciary Committee hearing that Tribe was Chairman Biden's favorite law professor.
Okay.
So how you could be more establishment than a chair professor at Harvard who is beloved of the Senate Judiciary Committee chairman and now the president, I don't know. I think he's about as establishment as possible.
Okay. Well, here's what he said on Twitter. And he says, the ones I feel sorry for are my administrative law colleagues who built their courses and careers around the intricacies of Chevron deference, which is what Chevron deference means. In that decision, there was the argument was that we should defer to the judgments of the agencies themselves.
Right. And the administrative law judges will be the ones who decide what statutes empowering or creating the agencies mean, not the federal judiciary.
Right. And so
the federal judiciary came up with this idea that would be the way it worked.
So he's worried about people who built their legal careers around this understanding might be out of a job. And so I responded with, look, I already support this decision. You don't have to keep convincing me. Because, my argument is that's a great benefit. I'm glad that that's part of it. I'm not sorry for these people. That's good.
Well, for anybody who thinks that the idea of the swamp is a myth, here we have reflection of it in one of its leaders. He's saying essentially, look, insofar as I'm concerned, one of the considerations one has to take into account in making a decision about the power of the administrative agencies is the effect it'll have not only on the people who work in the agency, but on ancillary people like law professors who study the administrative agency. By the way, can you imagine devoting your life to studying administrative law? I mean, I can't even imagine why you'd want to do that.
No. That would be a pretty sad existence. And then after all that, they're going to take this away from you.
Right.
So okay. So what then? What after? Before we get into what this all means, I want to read you something, and you tell me if it's by and large correct. I think it is, but this is what Spike Cohen wrote, because he started off by writing about what the particulars of the case were, because the case,
which were outrageous, of course.
Yes, right. So let me read what he wrote. A family fishing company, Loper Bright Enterprises, was being driven out of business because they couldn't afford the $700 per day they were being charged by the National Marine Fisheries Service to monitor their company. The thing is, federal law doesn't authorize the National Marine Fisheries Service to charge businesses for this. They just decided to start doing it in 2013. Why did they think they could get away with just charging people without any legal authorization? Because in 1984, in the Chevron decision, the Supreme Court decided that regulatory agencies were the experts in their fields, and that, hold on a minute, I scrolled too far, and the courts should just defer to their interpretation of the law. So for the past 40 years, federal agencies have been able to interpret laws to mean whatever they want, and the courts just had to go with it. It was called Chevron deference, and it put bureaucrats in charge of the country. It's how OSHA was able to decide that everyone who worked for a large company had to get the jab or be fired. No law gave them that authority, they just made it up. It's how the ATF was able to decide a piece of plastic was a machine gun. It's how the NCRS was able to decide that a small puddle was a protected wetlands. It's how out-of-control agencies have been able to create rules out of thin air and force you to comply, and the courts had to simply defer to them because they were the experts. That's what Chevron deference was. Is that about right?
Yeah, and actually, one of the dissents is from the former dean of Harvard Law School, Elena Kagan, who says, "Oh, this is outrageous. Of course, we should defer to the experts. But what does it require for you to become an expert working for the Marine Fisheries Service? It's not real expertise at all. It's just kind of sloughing off responsibility, I think." And this is a good example of the kind of thing you can expect if administrative agencies are left to themselves. They're going to drive people out of business by requiring them to pay for the activities of a Marine Fisheries Service.
Which, by the way, is an agency I'm sure most people had never heard of before. There it is.
Right.
So I'm trying to be as charitable as I can here, Kevin, because that's one of my qualities. Like I'm always looking for, why would terrible people hold the opinions they hold? And I'm trying to think of an innocent explanation for why you would weep at the overturning of this thing. Like what other than self-interest because you work in one of these bureaucracies, or because you've been trained to, in your particular field of law to work under this arrangement? How would an average American be harmed by the overturning of this?
I'm stumped. I don't know.
Okay, so it's not just me.
See it.
Okay.
Right, I don't think so. Justice Kagan, in her dissenting opinion in this case, said, well, it's generally true that people who work in administrative agencies for their careers are going to be specialists in the fields in which they're working, and they were going to know more about it than, say, Supreme Court justices. Well, this may be true in some sense, but that doesn't answer the question whether, for example, those people should be able to charge $700 a day to some private company to put an agent on the ships that it's sending out into the ocean, So I guess I understand that there's this kind of residual Wilsonian notion that we're going to have experts running the government.
Yep.
And so what had happened over time had been that the judges have just decided, well, okay, we're having experts run the government, but we're not the experts in every little area that the federal government is involved in. So we should just say we're going to let people who are in the administrative agencies make the ultimate decisions about what statutes they've been told to enforce mean. But of course, the general task of the federal courts is supposed to be to interpret statutes. And actually, Chief Justice Roberts said, well, okay, it may be true that federal judges don't know about fisheries, but we're the experts in interpreting statutes. But that's that's not something that some guy who's been hired to go out on a ship knows better than we do. So it does seem to me it was just kind of unwarranted fobbing off of this not only authority but responsibility by the federal courts.
Folks, in this day and age, there are a lot of competing demands for your time, and a lot of them are a complete waste of your time, unlike the Tom Woods Show. Well, I have an excellent way to deal with it all. With the Blinkist app, you can absorb huge amounts of information in 27 nonfiction categories, just about anything you could be interested in. So we're talking history, technology, career, philosophy, parenting, religion, and on and on. Blinkist takes each of these books, condenses it down to that 15-minute core you absolutely need to know, and you can read or listen to these 15-minute summaries. So a half-hour commute each way means the equivalent of 4 books consumed. And then you can decide, do I want to read this whole book, or was this really all I pretty much needed from that? Well, among the thousands and thousands of titles at Blinkist, you'll even find libertarian classics. You'll find works by Milton Friedman, Murray Rothbard, and even Ole Woods. Well, right now, Blinkist has a special offer just for our audience. Go to Blinkist.com/Woods to start your 7-day free trial and get 40% off a Blinkist premium membership. That's Blinkist, spelled Blinkist, Blinkist.com/Woods to get 40% off and a 7-day free trial. Blinkist.com/Woods. Now, for a limited time, you can even use Blinkist Connect to share your premium account. You'll get 2 premium subscriptions for the price of 1. And of course, now after, some incidents we've lived through, we now realize that there is also the strong possibility that people in charge of these agencies are unbelievably shocking mediocrities, and who have been given some kind of weird semi-plenary authority over the whole country.
Right. Well, it's at this point, I think it should never be shocking to find that anybody's actually a mediocrity.
It's not anymore. Not anymore.
I just can't imagine what kind of person would want to devote his life to doing this kind of thing. And so I think somebody with a really active mind is not what I would expect to find in one of these agencies. But even if it were, though, it doesn't solve the question, because the Constitution, the federal Constitution, says that there will be a judicial branch, and the judicial branch will decide legal disputes. And over time, this has been recognized as meaning it'll be the institution that decides what statutes mean, not administrative law judges. So those people are just bureaucrats who've been promoted into those positions. Who knows how competent they are to this kind of work? Nobody even asked. So I have for years thought this should happen and was happy to see it happening. And of course, we have the squealing from the usual suspects that makes you think, well, even if I hadn't been predisposed to like this idea, I guess I like it now because the right people are unhappy about it.
Exactly. Exactly. So, and
Lawrence Tribe's unhappy. That's all I need to know.
That is all I need to know. I mean, how consistently wrong can a person be? And not just wrong, but wrong in the most evil way. So that raises the issue of the grounds on which they object to it. Now, first, it's that, no doubt they object to the merits of the arguments, but they also will say that this breaks with precedent. This is a 40-year precedent. And then Roe versus Wade was a 50-year precedent. And we can talk about affirmative action too. And the Supreme Court keeps striking these down. And of course, that the argument is that we, in a free society, should have the expectation of legal stability. And so therefore a deference to tradition, to precedent. And so I want to take a minute to talk about that, because I would say, okay, if that's what you want, I have a couple of thoughts about this, but if that's what you want, don't hand down dumb opinions to start with, and then we won't have to reverse them. That's one way. Right. But the other thing is, look, I would rather have bad decisions overturned than stability of a dumb decision.
Well, I remember, I graduated from law school in 1990, right at about the time that the worst justice in history, William Brennan, and his sidekick Thurgood Marshall, were leaving the Supreme Court. And at the very end of their very long careers on the Supreme Court, both of them were complaining that it seemed that the court was now happier with overturning precedent than it ought to be. And those two guys actually held the records for voting to overturn most precedents. So it comes to me with just, I don't have any sympathy at all for arguments from people like these people. I mean, again,
no.
Lawrence Tribe, who has advocated overturning more precedent than Lawrence Tribe? Nobody. So, and he's lionized Brennan Marshall and the whole enterprise of remaking the federal system into a Wilsonian system where quote unquote experts are going to be telling the rest of us what to do, and there's nothing we can do about it. It should never change in any way. So, while I don't think I'm directly affected by administrative law on a regular basis, it seems to me that it's yet more progress.
Yeah, of course.
We talked about some months ago, we talked about all the screaming about the nomination by Trump of these new justices. And I said to you, I thought, well, this is an augury that finally the ship of state is turning. And it apparently has. It's taking on real issues that are going to have notable effects on people in business, on everyday people. The administrative agencies regulate communications, they regulate radio, they regulate television. Every part of your life is regulated by these people. Consumer products, your foodstuffs, everything you can think of. And good, it should be subject to government by people who are elected or people who've been appointed to federal courts, not to some guy who thinks, I'm 23, I don't have anything else to do. I think I'll go work for the IRS, No.
Yeah.
That guy I don't have any sympathy for. By the way, I once, for a few months, worked at the IRS. We'll talk about it some other time. So anyway, this is making all the right people go. Oh, another famous administrative law expert, I think, is Adrian Vermilde. I think he's an administrative law professor at Harvard too.
Yeah, I think so too. So a couple of things on this precedent thing. I mean, they should just say, as I tried to say to one of them on Twitter, just say, I don't like seeing my policy preferences overturned. Just say that. It's not that you care about precedent being overturned. Like that, right. That they would couch their own preferences in these high-minded legal concepts is partly what makes it so irritating. Just say, I don't like the outcome. I don't like the actual outcome of the decision and how it affects me and other people. Just say that. It's not that you care that a long-standing, and for crying out loud, this is something from the 1980s. We were all alive when this decision was reached. This is not like it's gone back to the Magna Carta or something. I mean, really. Tradition is 40 years now? That's precedent? That's what we're talking about? Right.
Well, they don't like the fact that we've apparently moved from a Supreme Court that's directed by progressive, capital P, progressive principles to one that's guided by what Robert Bork in a famous law review article in the 1970s, before he was famous, called neutral principles, right? So if you're going to have a government that's governed by neutral principles after all this time, you're going to expect there are going to be some significant bumps because we're going to make major changes. And this is one good example. So yet more benefit from having those judicial appointment fights, I think.
I think this is just
putting up with being called a gang rapist and Clarence Thomas being said to have harassed Anita Hill by putting a pubic hair on a Coke can and all this stuff. That's what that was. This is what that was about. This is the kind of thing that was about. They didn't want these kinds of changes.
Yeah. And yet here they are. And I think I'm just restating a different way something you already said, but as you say, you and I are not generally affected all that much on a day-to-day basis by what an administrative agency may do. But the thing that brings me the satisfaction is that this was one of those features of how the American government operates that seemed fixed. It seemed set in stone. It seemed immovable. And now that it's been overturned, as you say, it seems to open the prospect that maybe other seemingly immovable things may not be so immovable after all. And so it encourages the discouraged masses of whom, you and I are members.
Right. Yes. So I never thought this would, I hoped for this, but I never thought this would happen. It's really kind of amazing. It's kind of amazing.
Yeah. Yeah, it is. Now, what do you make of, did you have, I'm not going to put you on the spot because I didn't ask you to prep or anything for this, but that the case involving the question of free speech and the social media platforms, in that case, I was a little bit annoyed that, do you have let me put it this way, instead of going to the specifics of that case, what do you think about the Trump justices? In particular, are you able to distinguish one from another and say, I like this one better than this one and this one better than that one? Is it, would you say it's uncontroversial to say Gorsuch is the best?
Of his, yeah. But probably Alito and Thomas are more my speed. But yeah, Gorsuch is the best of the ones that Trump put on, right? Yeah. And the reason is, it seems he's got consistent principles and a consistent approach, and he's predictable. And, you think, well, predictability seems to be an indicator of lack of thought, but I don't see it that way. I think having a political philosophy, and there is a clear political philosophy underlying the U.S. Constitution, even though it's been ignored for 80 years or however long it's been. He and Thomas and Alito seem to have tried to derive one from their study and to be trying to apply it, which is, of course, what they took an oath to do. So I find that very appealing, even when I don't agree with the outcome in a particular case, which really, I don't really care that much about the outcome in a particular case.
Hey, everybody, let's take a minute to thank our sponsor, Persist SEO. If you are getting buried by your competition online, then build your brand, your reputation, and your lead flow with digital marketing by Persist SEO. If you are a small local business trying to compete against large companies in the service industry, then increase your visibility with Persist SEO. Or what if you have low or no leads coming in on a consistent basis? Well, then website search engine and conversion optimization can help move the needle to a more prosperous business model for you. Are you tired of cold calling and networking, meeting places getting shut down? Use your website as a lead generation engine. Or what if you're not showing up for your services in the search engines? Well, get found with Persist SEO's expert search engine optimization. All you have to do is call 770-580-3736 or visit them at ineedseo.help for a free website audit and consultation. That's 770-580-3736 or ineedseo.help. Now, of course, given the low intensity civil war that the U.S. is involved in right now, there is a lot of thought about what the impact of the 2024 presidential election could ultimately be on the composition of the court, because you never know about retirements or even death. So, what would be the likely? How old's Clarence Thomas? He must be up there by now.
He's, I believe, in his late 70s, isn't he? And he's overweight. An overweight black man in his late 70s, that's not a prescription for long life, I think.
I guess he just turned 76.
Yeah, and Sotomayor's not healthy and similarly overweight. And, once you're in your mid to late 70s, who knows? So some of them seem healthier than others.
Yeah.
But even if there were health problems, I'm sure they would not be publicly known.
No, that's true. That's true. But so potentially you would say at a minimum, in terms of reasonable possibility, there are two that could be named in the next presidential administration?
You'd think, wouldn't you? I think so.
Yeah. Sometimes I despair in a situation like this because I think the law schools are churning out such they're teaching law so badly and ideologically, and they're churning out terrible people. But then I'm consoled when people say, but remember, there are only so many Supreme Court justices, so many judgeships. You only need a certain number of sensible people.
Yeah, and there actually is a kind of vetting process because in general, you have people who are connected or known, connected to or known by Supreme Court justices who are kind of giving them hints as to whom they should choose as their clerks each term. And so over time, there's a list of fit nominees that are familiar to people high up in the political parties. That's why, especially the Democrats, you seldom get an appointee who doesn't turn out to be the kind of judge they hoped she would be, because they've been thoroughly vetted.
So do you think that's what it is? Because there really is a question about why it is that so many of the, let's say Republican appointees tend to grow during their tenure, and that's always bad. I don't want them to grow. I want them to be exactly the way they were. And you really think it's just a matter of, so you don't think there's any sense that they feel social pressure over time to make certain decisions?
Well, okay, so Justice Blackmun, who was appointed by Nixon, is a famous case of this quote-unquote growth, but he wasn't really known. And O'Connor was another quote-unquote growing justice, but she was not chosen on the basis of her record as a judge. She was chosen because she was essentially the most obvious available Republican woman. Right? Reagan had promised he would appoint a woman to the Supreme Court, so he appointed her, and that's what you get.
Yeah.
And I could go through a list of the other half dozen or so such people, and I think that more or less is the reason why they've turned out this way. Of course, I don't think either of the Bushes, especially I don't think Daddy Bush, cared that much about judicial appointments. It's an accident that Clarence Thomas turned out to be an originalist conservative. He just wanted a Republican black guy, I think, when Thurgood Marshall died. So it turned out Clarence Thomas was a very principled originalist. Who knew? It's about time we got a break.
Yeah, I know, really. I know, it's like, how many David Souters do we have to endure?
Actually, I don't know whether Daddy Bush knew about this, but Warren Rudman, who, remember, had been governor of New Hampshire and then was high up in the Bush administration, was a friend of Daddy Bush's. After Souter had been on the court for a few years, I think it was in an interview, he said, he had really pulled one over on the moral majority. So he knew that Souter was not a conservative, not a constitutional originalist, and that's what he wanted. So he told Daddy Bush he should appoint him, and that's where we got Souter.
All right, so that's the explanation, and so to me, this is a reason that 2024 does matter. I mean, I know Trump has his problem. Believe me, the guy makes me absolutely crazy. Like I just said this the other day, but he's gonna drain the swamp. So he brings on John Bolton, Mike Pompeo, and who's that? Nikki Haley. I mean, what? So again, as I keep saying, being president of the United States is probably the most important thing you're ever going to do. So you would think you would at least take the time to find out who the good guys are, who the people who are kind of agree with you are, as opposed to people who are going to stab you in the back, or people who are actively pushing against your every good instinct. You would think you would look that up.
Look who his fixer was when he was in private life before he became president, right? So
I don't know who you mean.
Oh, that the lawyer fellow who ended up testifying against him and revealing all the details about Stormy Daniels.
Yeah, okay.
I can't think of his name.
But I know who you mean. So it's true that sometimes he doesn't seem to be so good. So I totally get that. But on the other hand, like, what am I actually supposed to endure? A country with a Joe Biden or whoever's running him picking the next two Supreme Court justices? the thing is, with us in charge, with people at least remotely somewhat sympathetic, the left doesn't even have to worry that much because most of our decisions are, well, let the states decide it. But their decisions are all, we're going to decide everything for all you people. And I don't want that.
Not only for all you people, but for as many foreigners as we can affect too.
Yeah.
Right? Yeah.
Yeah. That's wild. So when these decisions come out, do you sit down and read them? Like when a papal encyclical would come out, I generally, before recent occupant, I would actually sit down and read it. I'd be interested to see what it said.
Well, it depends what it's about. So I kind of get an idea of what the subject matter is, and if it's on federalism or if it's on power of administrative law judges or that kind of thing, then I'll read it. But I don't generally care about most subfields in the field of constitutional history. So generally not.
Well, I do want to repeat to people that if you're thinking that reading a Supreme Court decision will be too difficult because it's full of legalese, it is true, as I've said before, that it'll have a lot of references to previous cases you may not have heard of, but they are generally written in understandable English for a reasonably educated person. So you can read them in.
Most of them are more political science essays than anything else. They're not in arcane language or such.
No, that's true. That's true. And especially when you get either a good opinion of the court or sometimes even better, a good dissent, it can actually be very satisfying to read. I thought Alito's dissent in that free speech case was very satisfying to read. He obviously was very familiar with the details. He had spent more time on it than the people writing the original opinion. So it was very, very satisfying to read that. So your Politically Incorrect Guide to the Constitution, did that come out? Like
2007?
2007. So it's over 15
How about
years.
That?
Well, wow.
We are old, man.
Holy cow.
Wow.
Yeah, no, I don't like my Politically Incorrect book came out literally 20 years ago. I don't like my books having anniversaries. It makes me old.
Yeah, well, my receding hairline has already made me old, so I don't have to worry about that.
True, but I hear that, but it's like, oh my gosh, it was like a young person's lifetime ago that I wrote this thing. But I'm telling you, this is
just the other day that occurred to me that it had been eons since the Politically Incorrect Guide to the Constitution. I sat at this very desk I'm sitting at right now and wrote it in about 4 or 5 months.
Yeah, same with me. With the
I just had the whole thing in my head, unlike any of my other books. So.
Yeah, it was stuff you think about all the time and you teach it.
Right.
But I mean, I've had I guess 3 of my kids have been born since that book. So it's really wild. But I'm not saying this out of flattery or because you happen to be on the show right now. But when I read your Politically Incorrect Guide to the Constitution, I don't know if you remember this. I either told you or I wrote in a review that next to your book, I thought my work on American history was as nothing compared to your honestly compared to your book on the Constitution. It just exceeded all expectations. It's a way better book than a book in that series with that kind of cheeky title would lead you to expect. So would you? I really would like it if you could make a kind of elevator pitch, even though it's an older book. It should it's older, but should still very much be read. What is it that makes that book different from others on this topic?
Well, the standard way to tell the story of constitutional history in the United States is to start with the Federalist Papers and then John Marshall, and you get the whole Hamiltonian account all the way down to the present. And I take the opposite position. I take the Jeffersonian, Madisonian view of the reasons why there was a Declaration of Independence, the reasons why they thought there needed to be at least reform to the Articles of Confederation, the form that the Constitution took, how they read it at the earliest times. And if you start with Jefferson's argument in 1774 about why Virginia should be regarded as a sovereign entity within a British Empire of related sovereignties, you end up with Clarence Thomas and Alito. But basically, it's one way of looking at it. It's completely opposite the Abraham Lincoln, Alexander Hamilton position that the Union pre-existed the Declaration of Independence. The country was one entity from the beginning. The Constitution was made by one American people, not ratified by separate states, but by the people in their states, as they put it. And then you end up with the idea that, well, the central government can do more or less anything. And it'll be the account you give will be a kind of vindication of what's happened, beginning with the progressives at the beginning of the 20th century all the way down to the present. So I'm telling the story from the opposite perspective, from the opponents of Marshall, their perspective.
Well, when I think about the case of Thomas is a far, far better Supreme Court justice than any president in my lifetime has been a president. And I was wondering about why would that be? And I wonder if the fact that you genuinely are insulated, I mean, yeah, we are all affected by political influences to one degree or another. And maybe, I'm sure some people would prefer not to be hated and disliked, although that does not seem to be anything that bothers Clarence Thomas any. But I wonder if that's the explanation for why Thomas is so much better a Supreme Court justice than any president is a president.
Well, it's an interesting question. It's, I think, related to his youth. He, of course, people may know the story of his upbringing. He was born into a very poor family. And at an early point, he developed an independent way of looking at the world. He was a black nationalist, and he decided he was not going to be dependent on other people giving him anything. And this just led him to a different way of looking at the government than you would get from somebody who had grown up, I think, in opposite circumstances from his. So he's a self-made entity. I don't think anybody cultivated him. I think he read a lot and decided what he agreed with, and there you are. So there's nothing phony about it. I didn't actually intend to come on here and lionize Clarence Thomas, but as I'm thinking out loud, I'm realizing I actually admire the guy. So how about that?
Yeah, no, as do I. And as I say, I enjoy reading his opinions, and
right,
and of course it can't be easy enduring the kinds of attacks he's endured for however many years at this point.
Beginning when Joe Biden sicked the Anita Hill story on him. Yeah. Joe Biden did that. Right.
Yeah. I could tell a boomer joke and say he doesn't remember doing that, but I'm not gonna lower myself to that level. So
well, I'm glad you're not doing that.
Yeah, isn't that a relief? So the takeaway from this is you need to go buy the Politically Incorrect Guide to the Constitution. I'll have it in the description of the video here, also at tomwoods.com/2512. And I don't know, I have to say, the Supreme Court is the one kind of the bright light. And of course, therefore, it is the part of the U.S. government that is under the most attack because, that's the upside down world we live in. Any final thoughts?
Well, if you read the book and you liked it, please review it positively on Amazon. That's very helpful, I understand. But if you haven't read Politically Incorrect Guide to the Constitution, I'm not saying buy it, but please do read it. I think it's very important. It's got a very important message.
It does indeed. And don't be a cheapskate. Go buy it. All right. It's not expensive. You know how much work Kevin put into this. I know you hear 4 to 5 months, but 4 to 5 months when you're also working full time is a lot. And in order to be able to write a book like that in 4 to 5 months, he had to study and learn for years and years and years. And so,
many years, yes.
Yeah. So, I mean, look, you're paying less than you'd pay for a steak dinner for that. Come on. So go click that link and get yourself a copy. And Kevin, thanks again.
You're welcome.
And thank you, ladies and gentlemen.
Make yourself and those you love less vulnerable to the regime, both mentally and physically. Get more forbidden information at tomsfreebooks.com and be sure to subscribe to the show wherever you listen. See you next time.
Like the sound of The Tom Woods Show? My audio production is provided by Podsworth Media. Check them out at podsworth.com.